Jason Miller's peaceful ranch in Texas was suddenly under attack, with intruders sent to destroy his property over a disputed HOA rule. At the center of the chaos was Karen Woods, whose relentless desire for control threatened to trample years of Jason's hard work. But when Jason stood his ground, armed only with the law and undeniable proof of ownership, everything turned upside down. And just wait. See how this tense confrontation unfolds and why justice ultimately claimed the victory. Jason Miller had always been an early riser. His mornings began with the soft glow of sunrise spilling across his small ranch in central Texas, the quiet broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle or the distant hum of a tractor. But that morning felt different. There was an almost imperceptible tension in the air, a heaviness that made him pause at the edge of his porch. He shook it off, attributing it to the lingering fatigue from a long week of tending to the ranch. Little did he know his life was about to be jolted in a way he never could have imagined. As he stepped outside, the familiar sight of rolling fields and weathered fences greeted him, offering a sense of calm he had relied on for years. Yet something was off. The old barn that had stood for decades, a relic of his family's labor and memories, seemed to shimmer with a subtle unease, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Then movement caught his eye, a flicker near the fence line. At first, he assumed it was a stray animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But the shapes moved with purpose, deliberate and unnerving. Jason's heart skipped a beat. 3 men were climbing over his fence, moving carefully, but with a confidence that sent a chill down his spine. They weren't local workers or neighbors. Their presence was unfamiliar and intimidating. He watched, frozen, as one of them balanced awkwardly on the top of the fence, then dropped lightly onto the ground. The others followed, and all 3 began to inspect the barn, pointing and muttering under their breaths. The sight made Jason's stomach tighten. He recognized the uniform of sorts they carried, a rough, professional air that suggested organization rather than coincidence. Confusion gave way to rising panic. Why were they here? What authority did they have to be on his property? Jason's mind raced. He remembered the notices from the HOA, formal letters filled with rules and regulations, but never had he imagined such extreme action could be taken without warning. And yet there they were, crossing the threshold of his ranch, invading the space he had built with his own hands. A sense of helplessness washed over him, sharp and cold, leaving him momentarily paralyzed. He tried to call someone, anyone, maybe a local authority or a neighbor, but his phone slipped from his hand in the rush of adrenaline. His eyes darted between the figures and the barn, watching as they circled, as if sizing up every corner, every detail, every structure that had been part of his life for years. Each gesture, each step, felt like an intrusion not just on his property, but on his very sense of safety. The barn, which once symbolized hard work and security, now seemed fragile, vulnerable to forces beyond his control. Jason's mind struggled to comprehend the scene. Was this real? Could the HOA truly have the audacity to act this way, sending strangers to enforce rules without even speaking to him first? The shock pressed down like a weight, making the morning sun feel distant and muted. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to confront, to do something. Yet the initial wave of disbelief held him rooted to the spot. His ranch, his home, his sanctuary had been crossed in a way he never expected, and the realization of just how precarious his situation was hit him like a cold wind through an open doorway. He could only watch as the 3 men moved with quiet determination, their presence alone casting a shadow over the land he loved. In that moment, Jason Miller understood something he hadn't before. Life on a ranch, no matter how peaceful, could be disrupted overnight by forces you never saw coming. And as the first tendrils of panic subsided, they were replaced by a more potent, simmering feeling, one that would shape everything that came next. With every passing minute, Jason's initial shock began to transform into a deep, simmering hatred, not for the strangers who had trespassed on his land, but for the woman who had sent them. Karen Woods, the ruthless head of the HOA. She had never once knocked on his door, never sent a personal message, never attempted even a polite conversation. Her only approach had been through cold, impersonal letters filled with rules and vague threats, each one reminding him that his autonomy was secondary to her rigid, self-serving vision of control. Now, watching her emissaries move across his property, Jason felt the full weight of her intrusion, not just into his ranch, but into his life, his routines, and the sense of peace he had cultivated over years of hard work. Hatred built slowly, like a fire starting from a single spark. Jason had always prided himself on his patience, on his ability to manage the challenges of ranch life with calm determination. He understood the weather, the soil, the animals. He understood hard work. But this was different. This wasn't nature testing him. This was a human force, deliberate and arrogant, trying to disrupt the life he had built. The more he watched, the clearer it became. These men were not acting independently. Every step they took, every glance toward the barn, every hushed conversation carried Karen's influence. She had orchestrated this intrusion, manipulating others to impose her will, and the knowledge inflamed him. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. Jason thought about the countless mornings he had spent repairing fences, feeding livestock, and tending crops. All the long hours of sweat and labor that had gone into making the ranch a home. And now, a single person, guided by a need for control and recognition, had decided that his efforts meant nothing. The rage was personal, directed at Karen's sense of entitlement, her belief that she could bend others to her vision without consequence. He could almost hear her voice in the background, ordering actions from the safety of her polished office, far removed from the dust and labor of real work, as if she held the power of life and property itself in her hands. As Jason paced along the porch, his mind replayed past interactions with the HOA. Each letter, each meeting, each passive-aggressive comment now appeared in a new light. Her patterns were unmistakable: escalate without warning, intimidate without discussion, assert authority without accountability. She thrived on control, on being feared, on knowing that others would bend before her demands. And he would not bend. His hatred was fueled not only by anger, but by the injustice of the imbalance. Someone so distant, so removed, trying to dictate the terms of his life and livelihood. Yet within that hatred there was a clarity forming. Jason realized that this fire, this intense emotion, could not be wasted on passive despair. It was evidence that he cared, that his life, his ranch, and his integrity were worth defending. Karen's arrogance had given him a reason to act, a motivation that was sharper than anything he had felt in years. The strangers on his land were temporary, but the lesson he intended to deliver, one built on truth, law, and resolve, would be lasting. His hatred, fierce and focused, became a tool, not blind aggression, but a guiding force that would direct his next steps toward justice. Jason clenched his fists, feeling the tension in his body shift from fear into resolve. Every element of his life that Karen had threatened, the barn, the fence, the hours of sweat etched into the soil, was now a symbol, a reminder of what he stood to protect. And in that moment, hatred transformed into determination, laying the groundwork for the confrontation that would come next. He would not be intimidated, he would not retreat. And Karen Woods would soon discover that the ranch and its owner were not so easily commanded. Jason Miller wasn't a man who let fear dictate his life. The initial shock and rising hatred had ignited something within him, a simmering energy that demanded action rather than despair. He knew that reacting impulsively would play into the hands of those who sought to intimidate him. Instead, he focused his anger into something productive, something that could protect not only his property, but the dignity and freedom he had spent years building. Every hour spent on the ranch, every fence post he had hammered, every crop planted and cared for, it was all part of his life, his legacy, and he would not allow it to be dismissed. Jason's first step was to reach out for professional guidance. He picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer, explaining the situation in detail, providing photos of the trespassing, and recounting the threats implied by the HOA's actions. The legal advice he received was clear: document everything, establish ownership, and make it undeniable that his rights were protected by law. As he hung up, he felt a measure of reassurance. Rage was no longer aimless. It had a direction, a purpose. His fury was now fuel for preparation, not chaos. The following day, the intruders returned. Their movements were cautious at first, as if they suspected resistance. Jason had anticipated this moment and was ready. He stood on the porch, a stack of neatly organized documents in his hands, property deeds, photographs, official correspondence, all carefully compiled to prove his legal rights. The sun was rising behind him, casting long shadows across the ranch that made him appear taller, more commanding. The thugs, expecting fear and submission, were met with the exact opposite. Jason's voice was steady, calm, and commanding. He explained step by step that their presence was unauthorized and that he possessed full legal proof of his ownership and rights. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. His rage was not blind. It was precise, disciplined, and unshakable. The combination of anger and authority created an undeniable presence, one that shifted the balance of power instantly. The men's initial confidence faltered as they realized they were no longer facing a passive target, but a man who knew the law, knew his rights, and would defend them. The ranch, which had moments before felt vulnerable, now seemed to pulse with Jason's determination. Every fence, every barn wall, every patch of earth became a symbol of his commitment. The intruders hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Jason could see the subtle changes, their careful steps, their lowered heads, their growing awareness that their actions would not go unchecked. His anger had been transformed into clarity and strategy, and the effect was immediate. By mid-morning, the confrontation had shifted. What had begun as intimidation now seemed almost comical, in contrast to the meticulous organization and authority Jason projected. The documents in his hands, once mere paper, had become shields and symbols of a man's resolve. Rage had evolved into power, not physical, not impulsive, but legal, moral, and unshakable. Jason stood firm, his chest heaving with the energy of righteous fury. In that moment, the intruders understood that this was not a ranch they could command, nor a man they could intimidate. Rage had become his strength, transforming fear into action and chaos into control. And in that quiet, tense standoff, The first seeds of victory were sown, proof that determination backed by knowledge and preparation could turn even the most aggressive challenge into a demonstration of unwavering authority. By mid-afternoon, the tension that had gripped Jason Miller's ranch since sunrise began to ease, replaced by a quiet, resolute energy. The intruders who had arrived with confident steps and an air of intimidation were now retreating. Jason had done nothing impulsive or reckless, no threats, no confrontation beyond what was necessary, but had relied instead on preparation, knowledge, and unwavering resolve. The legal documents in his hands, each carefully compiled proof of ownership, were more than paper. They were a declaration that his life, his work, and his property were not subject to the whims of anyone else. Within hours, the trespassers turned away, leaving the land as it had been, a testament to Jason's persistence and clarity of purpose. Karen Woods, the figure behind the intrusion, could no longer act without consequence. The HOA's carefully constructed rules and letters now seemed hollow when faced with clear legal realities. Any further action on her part risked penalties, litigation, and exposure of her overreach. Jason had transformed her tools of intimidation into proof of her limitations, turning what had been fear into a framework for justice. Watching her influence wane, Jason felt a powerful sense of vindication. He had faced the challenge not with anger alone, but with intelligence, foresight, and the calm certainty of someone who knew their rights and was unwilling to compromise them. As the last of the intruders climbed back over the fence and disappeared into the distant tree line, Jason allowed himself a deep breath. The morning had been filled with tension, his heart racing with shock and fury. But now, standing on the porch of his ranch, he could feel the full weight of accomplishment. The barn, the fences, the fields, every inch of his property remained untouched, protected by more than locks and fences. They had been shielded by knowledge, by patience, and by an unwavering refusal to yield to bullying or threats. The sense of satisfaction that settled in him was profound, a rare mixture of relief, pride, and quiet triumph. Jason looked around the ranch, taking in the familiar sights with new appreciation. The sun had climbed higher, casting warm light over the landscape, illuminating the golden hues of the fields and the well-worn wood of the barn. Everything seemed sharper, more vibrant, as if the day itself recognized the victory achieved. It was more than a win on paper. It was the restoration of peace, a confirmation that his labor, dedication, and principles could withstand even the most audacious challenges. There was also a subtle, enduring lesson in the day's events. Jason understood now that true power did not come from fear or force, but from knowledge, preparation, and unwavering integrity. His rage, once a raw and consuming emotion, had been transformed into methodical action. His hatred had sharpened his focus, his determination had guided his strategy, and now satisfaction filled the space where anxiety and anger had once dominated. He had not only defended his property, but reclaimed a sense of control, confidence, and personal justice. As the wind whispered through the tall grasses and the distant cattle called across the fields, Jason stood silently for a moment, feeling the ranch breathe around him. The last traces of intrusion had vanished, leaving only the familiar sounds of life he had nurtured for years. Justice had prevailed, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Jason allowed himself to fully embrace the calm, the pride, and the deep, enduring satisfaction of knowing that no one would ever disturb his peace again. The ranch was his, and its protection was a testament to the courage and wisdom he had found within himself.